Our thanks to Aisha Hasni for giving us that update, taking another live look there at the White House. So again, we're still seeing the effects of these historic tariffs that were announced yesterday. And you may be wondering to yourself, what's the history of presidents and others here in our government implementing tariffs throughout the United States history? So we do want to bring in to the conversation now Rich Rubino, political analyst, to talk a bit more about this. Rich, thanks so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I have to say, when we first started hearing about these potential Trump tariffs, I was also wondering this question: how have tariffs been implemented over the history of our country?
It's a great question. And if you go back, actually, the Republican Party was founded back in 1844 in Ripon, Wisconsin. Obviously, the idea of outlawing slavery in the new territories was their flagship issue, but they were also very much economic nationalists, and they also very much wanted there to be tariffs. They believed the tariffs would bring in revenue. And pretty much every Republican president, from basically Lincoln all the way through Herbert Hoover in 1929, were economic nationalists. In 1890, for example, Benjamin Harrison was president. William McKinley, the future president who Donald Trump often mentions as kind of a hero with the tariff movement, was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a congressman from Ohio. And he got the McKinley tariff through his committee, through the House and Senate, and it was signed by Republican President Benjamin Harrison. Grover Cleveland ran in 1892, in part wanting to reduce the results of that tariff. So it had always been basically a Republican issue. It's a very different, however, if you look at it in terms of the modern Republican Party. Basically, every Republican nominee from Eisenhower all the way through Mitt Romney in 2012 were free traders. In 1993, Bill Clinton, the Democrat, got NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, passed through both House and Senate, with the majority of his votes coming from Republicans. So it's always been, at least since 1953, when Eisenhower was the Republican nominee, Republicans were usually the free traders thinking about free markets. The Democrats were usually the party that wanted more regulations, if you will, on trade. Now, Donald Trump has completely transmagrified kind of the economic landscape when it comes to tariffs.
And as we're talking about this, the Great Depression and some of the acts that were put into place back in the late 20s and 30s impacted how these parties approach tariffs as well. Can you dive just a bit deeper into that?
Yes, well, Warren G. Harding actually was a fitwit who was elected in 1920, served until his death in 1923, signed a major tariff act in 1922. His successor, Calvin Coolidge, came in 1923. And when he assumed the presidency, he too was a tariff man, supported tariffs throughout his presidency. Herbert Hoover came in next in 1929. There was a lot of prosperity under Calvin Coolidge and his Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mellon, during the Coolidge administration, a lot of prosperity. Herbert Hoover ran in 1928 saying a car in every garage and a chicken in every pot. Then in 1929, the United States was felled with the Great Depression. But in 1930, he continued the policy in order to bring more revenue in. He signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which, although probably unfairly, is blamed for the Great Depression. The Depression had already started in 1929. What it probably did is it probably added fuel to the fire and really kind of progressed the Depression. And that was part of the reason why Herbert Hoover became extremely unpopular and in 1932 lost in a landslide to the Democratic free trader Franklin Roosevelt.
And so as we're talking about just some of the iterations that the party, particularly the Republican Party, has gone through on in their stance on tariffs, also something happened in the 1990s. Can we dive a bit deeper into what made that change happen? Of course, we do know this is when Pat Buchanan, he was running for the party. That made an impact, though, on how folks saw free trade versus these tariffs that could be in place.
Yes, very interesting. In 1992, George H.W. Bush was running for re-election. He had been very popular after the Gulf War, had a 91% job approval rating, the highest ever recorded for a United States president. However, there was a recession in 91 and 92, and Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush for the Republican presidential nomination. Buchanan had been a former free trader, having served under Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan, all who were very much exponents of free trade, pretty much unreserved, unfettered free trade. He changes his position in part. He goes to the Berlin, New Hampshire, where they had a paper mill, and the paper mills were basically dissipating in Berlin, New Hampshire as they were going overseas. And he said he met some of these people, and they basically told him about what it was like for their jobs to go overseas. Buchanan became very much of an economic nationalist, meaning somebody who favored tariffs. He ran against George H.W. Bush, almost beat Bush in the Republican primary, but Bush was still an unfettered free trader. George H.W. Bush that year, he runs for re-election. You had Ross Perot, who runs on Buchanan's platform on trade, basically. And then on the Democratic side, you had Bill Clinton, who said he favored NAFTA, but with some side agreements. Bill Clinton landed, by the way, in that Democratic primary. Former California Governor Jerry Brown was very much opposed to NAFTA, and Bill Clinton was very much somewhat more favorable to it, as was Paul Tsongas. Bill Clinton becomes president in 1993, makes some side agreements, and he has to get NAFTA done. In order to do that, he gets all the living former presidents, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush, all endorsed the NAFTA agreement. He had a few of them actually come to the White House and speak about NAFTA, and he got it through, but it was still seen as a free market issue. And there were many in the Democratic Party, like the House Minority Leader, Dick Gephardt, and the House Minority Whip, David Bonnier of Michigan, who are very much opposed to NAFTA and led the movement against the North American Free Trade Agreement. So how did Bill Clinton get it done? Bill Clinton got NAFTA through with Republican votes. He worked with Bob Dole, who was the Senate Minority Leader from Kansas, and Newt Gingrich, among others, who's now very much a Trumpite when it comes to free trade, who is the Minority Whip, a congressman from Georgia, Bob Michael, the House Minority Leader. They worked together to get NAFTA through. He got it through with Republicans. It was seen as the Republicans were seen as the party of free markets. And they'd been seen as a party of free markets, but when Donald Trump came on the political scene, instead of running as a traditional George W. Bush, Gerald Ford, Mitt Romney Republican, he decides he's going to go back to where Pat Buchanan was and says NAFTA was one of the worst agreements ever negotiated. And when he became president, he renegotiated it. But now the Republican Party, if you look at it with very few exceptions, literally 4 exceptions, are now very much economic nationalists in the spirit of Donald Trump.
And it's interesting to see just how these things change over time. And you mentioned some of those prominent Democrats as well over the years. Can you sort of just talk about the overhaul history of how Democrats have approached the tariff issue and where the biggest schism happened there in their party and what their ideology has been over the last few years?
Yes, I think that the Democratic Party was very much, at least originally, they were a party of free trade. They were seen as a conservative party. Free trade and lowering the tariff rates was seen as something that was very much a Democratic issue. Grover Cleveland, Martin Van Buren, 1837, very much somebody who, for example, was against we wanted to reduce the tariff. Grover Cleveland was elected first in 1884, then again in 1892, saying he wanted to reduce tariff rates, for example. But we really saw the schism of the Democratic Party, I think, in right around 1988, 1992. In the 1888 Democratic primaries, you had Democrats, what's called the Democratic Leadership Council. It's basically moderate Democrats like Chuck Robb of Virginia, Bill Clinton of Arkansas, Al Gore of Tennessee, who formed a movement to try to bring the Democratic Party to the center. And part of what they did is they favored free trade. So in 1992, in the Democratic primaries, the Democratic Leadership Council type Democrats like Paul Tsongas and Bill Clinton very much were in favor of free trade. Then you had some who were trying to be more populist. Bob Kerrey was one. And Bob Kerrey, with Bob Shrum was his advisor. Bob Shrum, a very liberal Democrat, convinced Bob Kerrey to go to a hockey net. And in one of his political advertisements, he's standing in front of a hockey net, and he's basically saying that there's been unfair trade practices from Japan, and if Japan continues to put tariffs on us, we're going to put tariffs on them. Listen to what Bob Kerrey was saying in 1992. It's very reminiscent of what Donald Trump is saying contemporaneously. Dick Gephardt, congressman from Missouri, ran in 1988, ran again in 2004. Very similar platform on free trade. So this really was this schism. The Clinton administration was Bill Clinton and some of those new Democrats who got NAFTA through them against the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, the more liberal bloodline, if you will, who were very much opposed to NAFTA, but they failed on that. But I think in terms of public relations wise, I think that they probably won the public relations battle in that when Donald Trump tried to renegotiate NAFTA, there were very few moderate Democrats who were outspoken or who won that battle.
And Rich, we have to kind of see this as maybe a window into the future. Of course, we know that right now some of the relationships between America's closest trading partners throughout history, including Canada and Mexico, is now strained due to some of these tariffs. If you were to say and rely on history as a place to kind of look as a window to the future, what do you think the outcome is going to be ultimately of these tariffs and how it's going to affect the long-term relationship between our countries?
I think long term, it's very much going to have deleterious effects. It's very much going to be a negative thing. I think that countries, even countries like Vietnam, who have very big tariffs in the United States, obviously, when you put tariff on a country, it is not seen as something that's positive. It means that they are going to have to be able to send less of their own products to the United States. Now, the United States can argue that it's unfair, it's an unfair balance of trade, that they're dumping products into our country, yet they're starting tariffs on their country. But that being said, just as a kind of a realpolitik type of a view, any country that has a tariff imposed on them, there's really no positive that comes from that country. Now, that being said, in the United States, there are some benefits, and certainly the fact that there will be the people will be buying American, that will certainly benefit, for example, certain manufacturers, steel industry in the United States. So it's really kind of there are going to be some that are very much benefit from it in the United States, and some that won't. Probably farmers, for example, but overseas, I think that most countries will take a very negative view of it.
I have to ask you before I let you go, has there been a moment in history that particularly sticks out to you with how this has affected our international relations? Have we seen a country respond over the last 50 or 100 years or so in a way to tariffs being placed on them that ended up changing the course of history?
I don't think necessarily tariffs being placed on them, but I do think the opposite, perhaps. In 2000, Bill Clinton, part of his legacy, his last year in office, he wanted to get China into the World Trade Organization. Yes, and Tom DeLay, who had really kind of spearheaded the impeachment of Bill Clinton, was the majority whip of the congressman from Texas, the majority whip in the United States House of Representatives, worked with Bill Clinton to try to get China into the World Trade Organization. China did get into the World Trade Organization, and today many believe that that was a mistake because they believe that China has kind of taken advantage of their role or taken advantage of the United States. And there are very few who I think argue that at least from a United States political perspective, that it's good that China was invited into the World Trade Organization. Now, obviously, there are some that certainly would benefit from that, but I think that it's more, and I think obviously you can have other effects. Certainly, NAFTA, for example, probably had a lot of benefit toward Mexico, toward Canada. The question is, did it benefit the United States? Probably yes, in terms of lower prices, but probably not in terms of allowing some products and some factories to go overseas. I think it may be hyperbolic, but many in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, J.D. Vance being one of them in the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the left wing of the Democratic Party, for example, also would say that many of the jobs that went overseas were because of the low tariffs. So it's always going to be an open question, just like history. It's going to continue to be an open question.
And it is certainly something that we're getting education here on Live Now from Fox, just on the history of tariffs. Again, Rich Rubino, political analyst, here to break these things down. Rich, any final thoughts before I let you go?
Just that this has completely changed. I have never, not since William Jennings Bryan in 1896 brought the Democratic Party to the left from the right-wing policies of Grover Cleveland, I have never seen a president be able to bring a party that was very much exponents of free trade in the last Republican administration, George W. Bush, and made it so that all but 4 Republicans favor Trump's economic nationalism. It's really almost unprecedented.
And it is something that we'll continue to follow right here on Live Now from Fox. Again, political analyst Rich Rubino here to help us break down some of these top headlines. We appreciate you for joining us here on Live Now.
Thank you so much for having me on again.